the Neverland Zoo that turned Michael Jackson's dream into reality. When people hear the name Neverland, they usually think of amusement rides, enormous gardens, and Michael Jackson's extraordinary fantasy of creating a place where childhood never had to end. But there was another part of Neverland that made the property unlike almost any celebrity home on Earth: Michael's private collection of animals. The ranch wasn't simply a residence. Contemporary accounts described it as a miniature theme park, complete with a zoo, train, amusement rides, gardens, and a large maintenance operation. And the animals weren't an afterthought. Michael became famous for keeping exotic creatures at Neverland, including his beloved chimpanzee Bubbles, who became one of the most recognizable animals associated with the singer. But the scale of the property meant caring for animals was a serious logistical operation. A forensic accountant later testified about Michael's finances and described Neverland as extraordinarily expensive to maintain, specifically mentioning the zoo, staff, animals, train, and amusement attractions as major ongoing expenses. That is where the sensational $1 billion zoo claim needs some context. There is no reliable evidence that Michael Jackson literally owned a zoo worth $1 billion. The figure appears to be part of the dramatic framing surrounding Neverland and Michael's enormous collection of possessions and creations. In fact, the financial evidence presented years later showed something much less glamorous. Neverland itself was an expensive operation that required substantial staffing and constant maintenance. One account described Michael spending hundreds of thousands of dollars simply maintaining the property's attractions and caring for the animals. But Michael wasn't trying to build an ordinary zoo. He was trying to build Neverland. The animals, the rides, the gardens, the train, and the extravagant buildings were all pieces of a much bigger fantasy, a private world designed around the childhood Michael believed he had missed, and some of the creatures he brought into that world became almost as famous as Michael himself. One animal in particular would become the unexpected star of Neverland, and eventually one of the most recognizable chimpanzees on the planet, the chimpanzee who became Michael Jackson's unlikely best friend. Before Bubbles became one of the most famous animals in pop culture, he was simply a young chimpanzee born in Texas in 1983. According to the Center for Great Apes, Bubbles was born at a biomedical research facility in Austin, and it was later purchased for Michael Jackson by animal trainer Bob Dunn. Their relationship quickly became extraordinary. Bubbles wasn't kept somewhere far away from Michael's world. He became part of it, accompanying the superstar on public appearances and eventually moving with him to Neverland. At Neverland, Bubbles was treated more like a member of Michael's household than an ordinary pet. Accounts describe him sleeping in a crib in Michael's bedroom, eating at the dinner table, watching movies in the private theater, and even using Michael's bathroom. Michael also took him on the road during the bad era. Bubbles traveled with him in Japan, appeared alongside him at public events, and even visited Osaka City Hall, where officials reportedly served the unusual guest green tea. He was also present around the recording of Bad and appeared in the Liberian Girl video. For Michael, Bubbles seemed to represent something deeper than celebrity novelty. People close to the singer described their relationship as unusually affectionate, while Michael's sister, LaToya, later recalled that he talked to animals as though they were his friends. But the relationship also became part of the media spectacle surrounding Michael. Bubbles was photographed constantly, and newspapers turned the unusual friendship into another symbol of Michael's increasingly eccentric public image. Even Michael's longtime manager, Frank DiLeo, reportedly pushed back against the idea that Bubbles was literally Michael's best friend, describing him instead as a beloved pet who Michael enjoyed bringing around. Eventually, however, Bubbles grew from a small, manageable infant into a powerful adult chimpanzee, and that created a problem Michael could no longer ignore. The animal that had once slept beside him and traveled around the world with him was becoming too strong to safely keep as a household companion. And that is when Michael's famous Neverland friendship took a heartbreaking turn. The day Michael realized Bubbles could no longer stay at Neverland. For Michael Jackson, Bubbles had once seemed almost like another member of the family. But chimpanzees don't remain tiny forever. As Bubbles matured, he became much larger, stronger, and less predictable, making the kind of close domestic life he had experienced as a young chimp increasingly unsafe. The Center for Great Apes explains that Bubbles eventually became too powerful for a human home environment and was moved away from that lifestyle. By the early 1990s, Bubbles was no longer living as Michael's everyday companion. He was moved to the California compound of animal trainer Bob Dunn, where he could receive specialized care. Later accounts say that Michael's relationship with Bubbles became much more limited as the chimp grew older. This wasn't necessarily a dramatic falling out between them, it was the reality of keeping an adult chimpanzee safely around people. Bubbles had been raised around humans, but he was still a great ape with extraordinary physical strength and very different social needs. One particularly important account came from the 2003 documentary Living with Michael Jackson. Michael explained that Bubbles had become increasingly difficult and that he was concerned about having the chimp around his newborn son, Prince Michael II. That concern reportedly contributed to Bubbles being moved away from the Jackson household. In other words, Michael wasn't simply deciding that he didn't want his famous companion anymore. He was facing a choice between his attachment to Bubbles and the safety of his growing family. And Bubbles' story eventually took a completely different direction. In 2005, he arrived at the Center for Great Apes in Florida after his trainer stopped working with great apes in entertainment. There, instead of living as a celebrity pet, Bubbles became part of a social group of other chimpanzees. The sanctuary describes him today as a calm, artistic animal who enjoys painting and has spent more than 2 decades living in sanctuary care. There's also a fascinating detail that corrects one of the most persistent stories about him. Bubbles was not left millions of dollars in Michael Jackson's will. The Center for Great Apes has explicitly said that Bubbles was not named in the will. However, the Jackson estate has supported his care through an ongoing arrangement, helping ensure that Michael's former companion would have a secure home for the rest of his life. So Bubbles didn't disappear because Michael stopped caring about him. His life simply reached a point where love wasn't enough to make a human household the right home. And that raises an even bigger question. Bubbles wasn't the only exotic animal Michael kept at Neverland. What happened to the rest of Michael's extraordinary animal kingdom? The other exotic animals that turned Neverland into a real-life zoo? Bubbles may have been the most famous resident of Neverland, but he was only one piece of Michael Jackson's extraordinary animal collection. Contemporary reporting described the ranch as home to tigers, giraffes, elephants, reptiles, birds, and other exotic animals. Some accounts also describe llamas, orangutans, alligators, and a wide variety of domestic animals. In other words, Neverland wasn't simply a mansion with a few unusual pets. It had become a full-scale animal operation spread across Michael's enormous estate. Among the most spectacular animals were Thriller and Sabu, 2 Bengal tigers. They were reportedly born in 1998 and lived at Neverland before eventually being moved to actress and animal advocate Tippi Hedren's Shambhala Preserve in California. Thriller remained there until her death from lung cancer in 2012, while Sabu continued living at the sanctuary. Then there were Michael's giraffes, elephants, an enormous collection of reptiles. An elephant named Ali was eventually donated to the Jacksonville Zoo, while another elephant, Baba, was reportedly transferred to a different owner. 4 giraffes were also relocated after Michael left Neverland, and the smaller creatures were just as unusual. Reports documented Chilean flamingos, exotic parrots, snakes, alligators, orangutans, llamas, and other animals being moved to facilities around the United States after Michael stopped living at Neverland. The Los Angeles Times reported that 13 flamingos went to Cape May County Zoo in New Jersey, while the tigers went to Shambhala and other animals were scattered among different sanctuaries and facilities. The relocation revealed something important about Michael's private zoo. Once he left Neverland, there was no single place capable of simply taking the entire collection. And that's where the dream became complicated. What had once looked like an incredible private animal kingdom suddenly became a huge logistical responsibility. Every tiger needed a safe enclosure. Every giraffe needed specialized care. Every reptile needed an appropriate habitat. The animals couldn't simply be packed up and moved like furniture. Some found excellent sanctuary homes. Others ended up in less certain circumstances. And contemporary animal welfare advocates said it was difficult to track where many of them ultimately went. So Neverland's zoo wasn't just a collection of strange celebrity pets. It became a story about what happens when an extraordinary dream grows larger than the person who created it. And among all those animals, there was one creature whose story became particularly controversial. An elephant whose arrival at Neverland was tied to one of Michael's closest celebrity friendships. The elephant Elizabeth Taylor gave Michael Jackson. In 1991, Elizabeth Taylor arrived at Neverland with a gift that sounded almost impossible even by Michael Jackson's standards: a live elephant. The elephant was named Gypsy, and Taylor gave her to Michael as a thank you after she married Larry Fertensky at Neverland Ranch. Taylor's longtime assistant later confirmed the story, explaining that she wanted to give Michael something extraordinary after he had hosted the wedding. The surprise was so unusual that Michael's own reaction became part of the story. Accounts of the moment describe Taylor arriving with the enormous animal, while Michael initially stood at a distance, apparently overwhelmed by just how large the gift was, but his hesitation quickly disappeared. He began feeding Gypsy carrots and talking about how much he loved elephants, calling them gentle giants. Michael later described Gypsy as one of the best presents he had ever received, and the elephant wasn't simply a novelty sitting somewhere on the property. Gypsy became part of the extraordinary animal landscape at Neverland. Contemporary descriptions of the ranch mention her alongside giraffes, chimpanzees, orangutans, reptiles, llamas, and other animals. One 1999 account described Gypsy as a 5-ton elephant living within Michael's private zoo, while other reporting confirms that she was an Asian elephant gifted by Taylor. The friendship between Michael and Elizabeth Taylor made the gift even more meaningful. Their relationship was built around an unusual connection. Both had become famous as children and had experienced the loss of a conventional childhood. Michael once explained that he could relax around Taylor because, in his words, they had lived the same life, and the elephant gift eventually became a perfect symbol of their friendship. Taylor gave Michael a real elephant. Michael later returned the joke with an elephant-themed gift for Taylor. They literally exchanged elephants. But Gypsy wasn't the only elephant associated with Neverland. Another elephant named Ali would later leave the ranch and end up in a completely different environment. One where Michael's former private zoo would collide with the realities of professional animal care. The Neverland elephant that ended up in a public zoo. Not every animal from Michael Jackson's Neverland disappeared into a private sanctuary. One of the most remarkable ended up somewhere millions of people could actually visit. His name was Ali, an African bull elephant who came to Neverland before eventually being donated to the Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens in Florida in 1997. The zoo itself confirms that Ali arrived from Michael's ranch that year. Ali's story is also important because he was not the famous elephant Elizabeth Taylor gave Michael. That elephant was Gypsy. Ali was a different animal, and his move to Jacksonville reflected the changing reality of Michael's private zoo. As the collection became increasingly difficult to maintain, animals were transferred to facilities better equipped for specialized care. Ali ultimately became the zoo's resident bull elephant and lived alongside female African elephants in the Elephant Plaza habitat. Then, more than 2 decades after leaving Neverland, Ali suddenly made headlines again. In June 2018, a gate was accidentally left open at his Jacksonville enclosure, allowing him to wander into a courtyard near the giraffe and elephant buildings. Zoo staff immediately activated safety procedures and used food to encourage him back inside. He was outside his enclosure for only about 20 minutes, and officials said neither visitors nor animals were injured. But Ali's most serious chapter came later. In 2024, the 34-year-old elephant underwent a major veterinary procedure to remove an infected tusk. About 30 large animal specialists were involved, including veterinary dentists and other experts from around the world. The 3.5-hour operation was described as comparable to a complicated dental procedure in humans, and the removed tusk was donated to the Smithsonian for research and preservation. Think about the journey, from Michael Jackson's extraordinary Neverland Ranch, to a public zoo, to an emergency escape, and finally to a complicated medical procedure involving specialists from multiple countries. Ali's life became a perfect example of what happened when Michael's private animal kingdom was dismantled. The animals didn't simply vanish. They were scattered into completely different worlds, and some continued making headlines long after Neverland was gone. But Ali was only one animal. There were still snakes, flamingos, giraffes, and other creatures whose futures became surprisingly complicated after Michael walked away from Neverland. The snakes, flamingos, and giraffes Michael left behind. When Michael Jackson finally left Neverland, the most difficult part wasn't abandoning the rides or the giant movie theater. It was figuring out what to do with the animals. His private collection included far more than Bubbles and the famous tigers. Accounts describe giraffes, reptiles, birds, flamingos, and other exotic animals spread throughout the ranch. By the time Michael had permanently stopped living at Neverland, most of these creatures had to be relocated to facilities elsewhere in the United States. Among the most recognizable were Michael's 4 giraffes. They were eventually moved to an animal facility in Arizona, where the story took a tragic turn. Reports said that 2 of the giraffes died in 2009, only weeks apart, while animal welfare concerns were raised about the conditions in which they were being kept. The surviving giraffes were later moved elsewhere. Their fate became a reminder that relocating exotic animals isn't as simple as finding them a new address. An animal accustomed to one environment can face enormous challenges when its surroundings, diet, climate, and social groups suddenly change. Then there were the flamingos. More than a dozen Chilean flamingos from Neverland were transferred to Cape May County Park and Zoo in New Jersey, where they could live in a professionally managed environment. The birds became one of the clearer success stories from the dismantling of Michael's private zoo, with the zoo providing specialized indoor and outdoor habitats for them. And the reptiles were perhaps the strangest chapter of all. Michael reportedly kept large snakes, including an albino Burmese python named Madonna, along with other reptiles and alligators. After Neverland was abandoned, many of these animals were relocated to wildlife facilities. The scale of the collection meant that animal organizations and caretakers had to work out individual arrangements rather than simply moving everything to one location. The irony is striking. Michael had created Neverland as a place where his animals could exist alongside his fantasy world. But once he left, the fantasy had to be dismantled animal by animal. Some found safe sanctuaries. Some entered professional zoos. Some faced uncertain futures. And one of the most famous animals of all, Bubbles the chimpanzee, would eventually find something Neverland could never truly provide him. A permanent home surrounded by other chimpanzees, where Bubbles lives today and who pays for his care. The chimpanzee who once traveled the world with Michael Jackson now lives a life that could not be more different from the celebrity spotlight. Bubbles is still alive, and since 2005, he has lived at the Center for Great Apes in Wauchula, Florida. The sanctuary describes him as a mature male chimpanzee who now lives within a social group alongside other chimpanzees. Instead of cameras, hotel rooms, and stage appearances, his days revolve around companionship, enrichment, food, rest, and the natural behaviors that come with living among his own kind. And Bubbles has developed some surprisingly artistic habits. The center says he enjoys painting, and caregivers describe him as calm, gentle, shy, and playful. He has also become an important member of his chimpanzee group. This is significant because Bubbles spent his early years being raised around humans and working in entertainment. His sanctuary life gives him something his life with Michael could never fully provide: a permanent social environment with other chimpanzees. The center specifically emphasizes that his story demonstrates why great apes ultimately belong with their own kind, rather than being kept as household pets. But here's the part many people don't know. Michael Jackson's estate still helps pay for Bubbles' care. The Center for Great Apes says the estate provides annual support toward his lifelong sanctuary needs. The arrangement has continued for years, helping cover the cost of the specialized food, veterinary care, staff, housing, and enrichment required for an adult chimpanzee. Recent reporting from the sanctuary's founder also confirms that the estate continues to fund Bubbles' care. And there is one important detail that destroys a popular internet myth. Bubbles was not left millions of dollars in Michael Jackson's will. The sanctuary says he wasn't named as a beneficiary. His continuing support comes through the estate's contributions to his care, not through a personal fortune supposedly inherited by a chimpanzee. So the little chimpanzee who once sat beside Michael Jackson at the dinner table ultimately found something far more valuable than celebrity. He found a permanent home. And remarkably, Bubbles isn't the only part of Michael's animal legacy that survived him. Because when you look at what happened to Neverland's animals, one question becomes unavoidable. Was Michael Jackson really building a zoo? Or was he trying to create the childhood world he never had? The real reason Michael built his incredible animal kingdom. The animals at Neverland can look almost unbelievable from the outside. Elephants, giraffes, tigers, crocodiles, snakes, chimpanzees. Michael Jackson had created an animal world that seemed more like a fantasy than a private residence. But when Michael was asked why he built Neverland, his answer was surprisingly personal. In a 2003 interview with Ed Bradley, he explained that he wanted to create everything he never had as a child. He had spent much of his childhood rehearsing, recording, and touring, so he couldn't simply go to amusement parks or enjoy ordinary childhood experiences. Neverland, he said, became his way of creating that world behind his own gates. And Michael didn't separate the animals from that dream. He specifically connected the zoo to the things he had missed growing up. In another interview, he explained that he loved animals because they represented qualities he valued: purity, honesty, and friendship without judgment. For Michael, animals weren't merely decorations for an extravagant property. They were companions and part of the environment he had created for himself. That helps explain why Bubbles became so important to him and why he surrounded himself with creatures that most people could only imagine seeing in a professional zoo. But there was another reason Neverland's animals mattered. Michael wanted other children to experience the world he had built. He repeatedly described inviting sick, disadvantaged, and underprivileged children to the ranch. They could see the animals, ride attractions, watch movies, and temporarily escape the difficulties of their everyday lives. Michael told Bradley that he couldn't freely visit ordinary public attractions because of his fame, so he created a private world where he could experience those things while also sharing them with children. And that makes the word zoo slightly misleading. Neverland wasn't created simply because Michael wanted to collect exotic animals. The animals were part of something much larger. A private fantasy, a refuge from fame, and an attempt to recreate the childhood he believed he had lost. The irony is that the same world Michael created to escape reality eventually became one of the most scrutinized places on Earth. And when Michael finally walked away from Neverland, his dream didn't disappear all at once. The rides were dismantled, the zoo was emptied, the animals were scattered. And the place that was supposed to represent Michael's happiest escape became a symbol of something much more complicated. What really happened to Michael Jackson's animal kingdom after Neverland? When Michael Jackson finally left Neverland in 2005, his enormous animal kingdom could not simply remain frozen in time. The ranch had contained an extraordinary mixture of exotic and domestic animals, but once Michael was no longer living there, they needed permanent homes and professional care. Over the following years, the collection was dismantled piece by piece. Bubbles went to the Center for Great Apes in Florida. Thriller and Sabu went to Tippi Hedren's Shambhala Preserve. 13 Chilean flamingos were relocated to Cape May County Zoo, while elephants, giraffes, reptiles, birds, and other animals were sent to different facilities. But there wasn't a perfectly happy ending for every animal. Some destinations became controversial, particularly after reports emerged about the conditions surrounding some of the giraffes and other exotic animals. In 2009, animal welfare groups said they couldn't even determine the final location of many former Neverland animals. The Los Angeles Times reported concerns about animals being scattered among private owners and facilities, while PETA warned that Jackson's experience illustrated the difficulty of keeping wild animals in private collections, even when the original intention may have been affectionate. The story therefore became bigger than Michael Jackson himself. It became a lesson in how complicated the long-term care of exotic animals can be. Yet some stories ended on a remarkably positive note. Bubbles is still alive and living at the Center for Great Apes, where he has spent years interacting with other chimpanzees rather than living as a human-style household pet. Ali, the elephant formerly associated with Neverland, became a resident of Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens and later underwent major veterinary treatment. And Michael's former tigers continued their lives at Shambhala, where they were given specialized sanctuary care. So what happened to Michael Jackson's $1 billion zoo? It didn't disappear, it fragmented. The animals went in different directions, into sanctuaries, zoos, wildlife facilities, and other homes. Some became obscure, others continued making headlines decades later. And Bubbles, the little chimp who once traveled beside the king of pop, became the living reminder of a bizarre chapter in Michael's life that most people could never have imagined. Neverland was supposed to be Michael's escape from the ordinary world, but after he left, the animals had to return to a world where fantasy wasn't enough. And perhaps that is the strangest legacy of Neverland. Michael built an animal kingdom for himself, but its real story continued long after the king had left the castle. If you enjoyed this journey inside Michael Jackson's extraordinary world, subscribe for more untold stories, hidden details, and deeper looks behind the legends. End of documentary. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more rare Michael Jackson stories, behind-the-scenes discoveries, and untold moments from music history. Until next time, thank you for watching.